We're super excited. So, what I will do is I will first hand it off to Magnus to say some opening words about the new book. And then I'll have a few questions for Magnus, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. And I would love for you to ask your question in person, so feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you to ask questions. If you'd like, you can also submit questions using the chat function here, and I will read it out loud if you prefer that. But with that said, let's turn it over to Magnus.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. And yeah, welcome everyone. I'm very excited to finally share my book with all of you and also to say a few words about it. I've prepared some notes on some key points that I thought would be worth sharing and including some things that maybe are framed perhaps a bit differently than what I did in the book itself, so that hopefully it can also be of benefit even if one has read the book or will read the book. So yeah, for some general background, Compassionate Purpose is it completes a trilogy on the project of reducing suffering, where my book Suffering Focused Ethics, published back in 2020, provided the moral foundation and explored some general implications of suffering focused ethics. Yeah, that was the first book in this trilogy, and which was followed by the book Recent Politics, which in some sense applies suffering focused ethics at the political and institutional level. So in that book, I try to review various considerations and empirical evidence in order to gain a better sense of which policies and institutions might be helpful for reducing suffering to the extent we can make sensible claims about that. And my book, Compassionate Purpose, actually tries to do a very similar thing, only at the personal level, as opposed to, yeah, the broader institutional level. So we're sort of turning the lens and zooming in on ourselves in order to, yeah, seeking to better address some of the personal challenges that we face in reducing suffering, and also seeking to provide practical tools for improving our efforts to reduce suffering. So while the focus is more personal, it's not myopic. It's still ultimately with this aim of seeking to have a beneficial impact. And to say a little bit more, a reason I thought this book was worth writing was that there seemed to be a real gap when it comes to these more personal aspects. And in some sense, I myself might also have been guilty in perhaps rushing a bit too quickly to these big, difficult, trying to tackle big, difficult ethical issues without first trying to provide some of the tools for us to actually be able to handle those issues, to face them, to turn towards them, and to try to take action. So this book is sort of me trying to maybe make up for my past sins and finally cover that aspect more. Yeah, and of course also something that I suspect many here on this call will be able to relate to many of these challenges, right? Because many of us will have faced them in day-to-day life, and when trying to reduce suffering. Something that is I want to highlight as a general framework underlying the book, that informs much of the book throughout, even if often implicitly, is this focus on improving different traits that are relevant to reducing suffering. And a useful point to keep in mind about those traits, and not just traits, but also habits and mindsets and attitudes and the like, is that they very often follow this like inverted U curve, right? Some very obvious examples of that might be sleep or specific nutrients, where it's kind of obvious and common knowledge that we can have both too much and too little, or do both too much or too little. But I argue that yeah, the same plausibly applies to many traits such as, for example, emotional empathy, or for that matter, guilt. Also, of course, there are different forms of guilt, but guilt about specific actions. Um, Arguably, it also applies to hope, and even, which is maybe of particular relevance to effective altruists, it even applies to optimization efforts of deliberate optimization itself, where we can also, yeah, many of us may fall into a trap of actually over optimizing to a point where it becomes obsessive and counterproductive, yeah, less effective in terms of creating real world change. Um, so yeah, I do find it worth emphasizing that general U curve, which I think can be quite relevant and useful to keep in mind, both not just in the context of personal optimization, but in many domains of optimization in general, even if it can seem very simple, but like this, more is not always better, and the reality of trade-offs and so on. Yeah, another key thing that I want to stress about the book and about its one of its key aims is to help prepare us and to provide some of the core tools and build the resilience for being able to face unpleasant conclusions, which I argue is often often represents a key bottleneck, our willingness or our ability or inability to face unpleasant or inconvenient conclusions, or even considerations more broadly. And to give some examples of what that might mean, it can include questions about whether insects are able to suffer. It can include like just the general prevalence of extreme suffering in the world. Um, its sheer prevalence, which often we can have a very narrow conception of that, which might be limited to perhaps a few salient hotspots, as opposed to this sadly more global and ongoing phenomenon that it is. Um, Also, very inconveniently, it can include the extent of our uncertainty when trying to reduce suffering, which is obviously extremely relevant in terms of how we go about this effort of reducing suffering. And of course, closely related to that is like various kinds of backfire risks, like the magnitude of the backfire risks, and how backfire risks can also be said to be, in some sense, quite prevalent, right? Associated with, unfortunately, virtually all efforts we can think of that might be helpful. Yeah, and lastly, I also, another potentially very unpleasant conclusion is the plausible utility of effort and hard work in seeking to reduce suffering, which might seem to go against some like other points that are often emphasized in this context of self-care, but I think both can actually be quite true at the same time. So there might be an underemphasis on self-care, while at the same time it might also be true that, for example, working harder might be generally quite helpful, but up to a point, of course, right? That's back to this inverted U curve of at a certain point or range of optimization. But yeah, those are some of the core points I wanted to emphasize. And then, of course, finally in the book, I also do try to put it all to some more direct practical use in by pointing at least to some broad suggestions for concrete ways in which we might take action to reduce suffering, which I'm very happy to talk more about here with all of you. So that was all. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Magnus. We just had a point of clarification from Leonardo. What is a backfire risk that you mentioned?
Right. Yeah. So, but in like the symbols terms, um, a backfire risk would simply be a risk that some action that we take to reduce suffering ends up causing more suffering, right? Which could happen perhaps in various ways. Perhaps there are opposing factions who don't like a particular action and who take action against us, or it could simply be some unforeseen consequences of, say, a given intervention where we have failed to consider how it might go badly.
Thanks. I'm curious if you could discuss a little bit more about these psychological barriers or challenges that you mentioned. You know, like, yeah, what keeps people on the personal level from being able to reduce suffering effectively, in your view?
Yeah, so I think in a general clarification, which maybe I should also mention, and that also informs the book in general, is that there can be a lot of individual variation in terms of what our bottlenecks or hurdles might be. But with that being said, I do think there are some, general recurrent themes. So one example, obviously, is that facing suffering, turning towards suffering can just feel really overwhelming. We can feel a lot of distress, many of us, when thinking about or seeing cases of suffering, um, and also risks of future suffering, right? So it can just be deeply unsettling. And that is like one of the core challenges that I try to tackle, or at least, explore ways to handle better. One prominent theme there is what's called empathic distress. I mean, actually, it can take many different forms, right? The distress we can feel in the face of suffering, but empathic distress is essentially the the pain or distress that we feel when we feel the feelings of someone else. So it's for many people quite a common reaction, right? That when we see some suffering, we also feel it ourselves. For some people, it can even be um, quite specific to the extent that someone else hurts a body part and we can feel pain in the same body part. But yeah, empathic distress is a very common challenge, and thankfully there are some ways to actually ease empathic distress. So one prominent one is to that I also devote a whole chapter to. This is chapter 7 in the book on compassion for others. So shifting more towards more of a compassion based motivation for reducing suffering as opposed to an empathy based motivation, where the empathy rests a lot, and this is particularly what's called emotional empathy, on sharing the suffering of another, so feeling what another feels. Whereas compassion, in contrast, is, as commonly defined by psychologists, is a matter of having the desire and motivation to reduce suffering, which importantly doesn't necessarily require that we take the suffering in and strongly share it ourselves, but that we stick to this desire to reduce suffering. And that's actually also it's a strong tradition in Buddhism, actually, to train this compassionate motivation, this compassionate desire. And indeed, hence the title also of this book, that was quite deliberate, that it's one of the core ways we can address this challenge, is to lean more and train more in compassion. I'm not necessarily making the strong claim that we should get rid of emotional empathy, as some authors have argued, but it does seem safer to focus more on the promotion of compassion. There are also some other challenges one could highlight. Maybe, I mean, it turns out empirically, and this is also in fact, another entire chapter in the book on self-compassion, having compassion for ourselves, caring about our own suffering, and being motivated to reduce and prevent our own suffering. It turns out that people who struggle with what's sometimes called compassion fatigue, although that term has also been criticized, but basically altruistic burnout, burning out when trying to reduce suffering and trying to help others. It turns out that's strongly correlated with having a low level of self-compassion, or indeed having a lot of harsh self-criticism. And this is not just correlational studies. There are also intervention studies where self-compassion interventions help reduce rates of such burnout. So that's another like key tool, reducing such harsh self-criticism and adopting more self-compassionate ways of relating to ourselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things I sometimes hear or think about is that not only is this task of reducing suffering, can it be overwhelming given how much suffering there is, but it also might somewhat oddly feel abstract to people if they're not, for instance, reducing suffering right in front of them, right? If they more have like a longer term conception and working on a longer term project of reducing suffering, like the Center for Reducing Suffering is, the goal might feel abstract and a bit hard to sort of stay focused on, stay motivated towards. What are your thoughts about this and recommendations for overcoming this?
Yeah, that's a great point, and that is a genuine challenge, even if it's maybe a less common one, like broadly, of course. But yes, some of us will face that challenge, and it turns out that um, having there's empirical work on how indeed being more having a clear sense of the difference we can make helps does help motivate pro-social action, and specifically action to reduce suffering. So that is suggestive of as to how we might help motivate ourselves in this way, namely to try to make the difference more concrete, right? So this is kind of a problem of abstractness, and maybe we can also have maybe there is a mix of, which is also in some sense what I try to argue for in the book, a mix of a abstract plus concrete, maybe thinking tool we can use to improve our motivation in this respect, namely by specifically trying to focus on the difference we can make, right? So that obviously there's a lot of suffering, sadly, going on that we can't do much about, but we can try to focus on the difference we actually can make, right? And this is a key point I also make in the context of how we can stay motivated when trying to reduce suffering, really seeking to focus on that difference, and not least to try to keep in mind how actually, despite all this sort of the abstractness, the abstract character of this talk, how this difference we're talking about is a real world, concrete, directly felt difference, right? Of a conscious experience similar to our own. And I think it can be helpful to try to keep that aspect in mind, to so to speak, make that more salient, that this abstract talk relates to something deeply concrete and real.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I will just ask one or two more questions and then turn it over and to the audience. So get your questions ready. I'm just curious. Another thing that you bring up in the book is the theme about social relationships and the way we interact with broader society. And it seems to me that this could be another barrier to reducing suffering effectively because, unfortunately, broader society, sometimes is skeptical of a goal that's, say, focused on reducing suffering, and it may be hard to sustain relationships with people and do, focus on doing normal things. Oh, sorry. Yep. Doing normal things, normal social interactions, or normal events or normal culture that does not focus on reducing suffering. So, what are your thoughts about sort of integrating with broader society and maintaining healthy relationships with broader society, even if this poses a challenge to reducing suffering?
Yeah, that's a great question, and also itself a huge challenge that likewise I devoted an entire chapter to. In brief, like in broad terms, something I would emphasize there is to try to find common ground, because it's true that it can feel, one might easily feel like alienated and isolated from the rest of society, and unfortunately sometimes even one's closer social circles. And in that context, I think it can be helpful. It's maybe again also a matter of what we make salient, right? So it can be very easy to make salient all the many disagreements that we can have with people around us and society at large. But I think there's also value in then trying to look at the real, which actually is real common ground, right? When we talk about, for example, I mean, it can actually be many different things, but just an obvious example I give in the book is that of like trying to protect children, right? That's actually something that most people will tend to strongly agree with. That's a core value, and it's yeah, like it's a real point of agreement, and likewise, like beyond. No, I should maybe give one more example, right? One can also talk about, for example, common ground on various norms of, say, like basic tolerance of at least other people and differences of opinion and say norms of free speech and the like, right? These are norms that at least many of us are lucky enough to live in society that share some of some basic agreement on such points. Um, but that beyond then that common ground, I also think it's worth keeping in mind, um, or trying to strive for what we might call like pragmatic compromise in relationships. So rather than having this notion of like very idealistic, it must be 100% or nothing kind of solution, that one can strive to more find maybe 70% compromises where we like each party gets some of what they want. They might not, it's not like a perfect resolution to some um, difficult challenge, but at least one can get some of the way. And that's a way in which I think even if we have, and rightly so, have ambitious moral goals, it can be useful to also be realistic and to not be perfectionistic in how we interact socially and yeah, generally go about our social lives, right? So just as a general reality, it's a very imperfect world, and that has some implications when it comes to what it means to live a pragmatic life for reducing suffering, and an effective one. Um, yeah, maybe one last thing I would also emphasize, we can also, that can be helpful to keep in mind, especially when we mm, maybe think about the value of taking a pragmatic approach, is to also keep in mind just frankly the many could you say like the many benefits that we also get out of our social relationships, right? So when trying to reduce suffering, one might fall into some kind of one-sided mindset from which it's like it's all obstacle, and that's just about all it is. But of course, that is a very incomplete perspective, right? In that we also gain a lot from our social relationships, right? And in fact, to an extent that we might not, that can be difficult to appreciate, given just how many layered the social life is in general. So yeah, those would be, I think, some of the core points I emphasize.
Great. Thank you, Magnus. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand or send it in the chat. Let's start with Leonardo.
Thank you, Magnus. I really appreciate the ideas that you're bringing. I do have a couple of questions. The first one will be related with how does it look like to apply this framework in your personal life? Do you have some examples of where, let's say, this compassionate purpose or drive took you in different directions, and I'm particularly wanting to break, let's say, from the previous. Uh, that will be my first question.
So
Uh,
I think,
was it audible
well, some of
or
it kind of,
did we lose
yeah,
connection
I
a
think
little
it fell
bit?
out a little bit, at least on my end. So um, what I heard was about like application in my own life, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I heard much more than that, unfortunately.
Yeah, basically it was how this compassionate purpose framework was something guiding you in your personal life, if you have some example about it, and how maybe it help you to break from, let's say, a more normal stance of not necessarily doing anything about suffering out there versus starting to take some active steps to transform it?
Right. Yeah. Thanks a lot for your question. I mean, so I did mention that the order in which I wrote the book was perhaps a bit wrong, right? So I started writing first the software-focused ethics, and then later on these psychological tools, like trying to explore and cover some of those. And to be honest, in my own life, I have probably also kind of lived it in that reverse order, like jumping into it before actually having the tools myself to necessarily handle these challenges. So my could say my commitment to reducing suffering was there prior to at least like having these concrete helpful tools. Of course, some of them by necessity one would have to acquire on the fly. Um, but yeah, so at least in my case, the values were sort of largely in place in the first place. So then one way to maybe interpret the question would be how then these tools have been helpful in in managing that. And honestly, for me, I would say like most of the tools and topics I touch on are ones that are what can I say, at least very recognizable from my own life and things I've applied to some extent. Yeah, and that in fact I would say a big one for me has indeed been this I'm sorry for the background noise, by the way. Um, but yeah, a big one has in fact been this turning more towards a compassion-based motivation. That has been quite, I would say, almost revolutionary in my own life because I used to be, say, a decade back, I was quite overwhelmed by empathic distress would be one way to put it, or even Weltschmerz, right? So the ongoing suffering of other sentient beings. And I did have this, I guess, implicit sense or conviction that I should be feeling their suffering more, that there would be something right and appropriate about that. And my current view is actually, I mean, as I said, it's a little bit nuanced. I'm not someone who says we should have 0 degrees of empathy at all. Um, Please let me know, by the way, if this is excessive, the background noise. But anyways, yes. So more compassion, more of a compassion-based motivation has been quite revolutionary for me as one thing I would emphasize.
Thank you. Patricia?
Okay, good evening, everyone. I want to know, during the course of your presentation, you made mention of a backfire risk. I want to know, how do you handle backfire risk? Here you are, you have made preparation to reduce suffering. You have made all your plans very well, perfectly, and all the strategies, they are in place, everything is fine. All of a sudden, those things, they are working against you. So how do you handle it? Do you just back up? So do you just still continue no matter? So I just want to know, how do you handle when you experience backfire risk? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a great question and a super difficult one. To be perfectly honest, I don't think that probably anyone has an especially satisfying answer or solution to this question or problem. Yeah, it is a real major problem that also people working on this are trying seriously to grapple with. What I can say in my own case, what I tend to find reasonable and plausible is to try to proceed with some significant level of caution and to try to reflect quite carefully. And of course, there can be a real tension there, right? And we do want to take forceful action, ideally, if we can, to reduce suffering, right? There's ongoing suffering. There are real risks of suffering getting worse in the future. But yeah, nevertheless, I do tend to, the sort of practical balance that I try to strike is one of being relatively cautious while nevertheless trying to take some meaningful action to reduce suffering that seems, all things considered, beneficial, right? To the best of, given our best estimates, and yeah, what we can, the data and evidence we have available to us, and considerations, theoretical considerations in general. But, and this, I think what I mentioned also, I would dare to claim, is also broadly how we tend to think of it, approach it at the Center for Reducing Suffering, and maybe even generally, although I don't want to speak on behalf of others, but I think maybe generally this is my impression, that people trying to reduce S risks in general, risks of astronomical future suffering, also tend to take de facto something along the lines of this approach. But yeah, I mean, I'm afraid that's maybe the best or least unsatisfying answer I can give to this question.
Rochelle? Oops. Did we lose Rochelle? Oh, sorry.
Hello? Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm hearing you
Yeah.
fine, thanks.
Okay. Hi, Magnus. Um, well, I'm motivated to like make a life out of putting my part in to reduce suffering in the world based on my own experience with suffering. I'm finding that I found um your the title of your first book on a syllabus in the back seat of someone's car when I was going to an animal activist protest. And so I've found my place in an organization where I'm starting to be conscious and acting and putting action into helping animals. And so it's kind of nice to find like a niche where it's not directly impact on my upon my own suffering, because I think that would be a little bit too much for me to handle. But I am finding that it's a good outlet for me releasing some of my own suffering through service. And I wanted to know, how realistic is it to for someone like me to make a life out of trying to reduce suffering in the world?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a really great question also. I mean, and it's, unfortunately, it's a bit difficult to answer, right? Because obviously I wish it were much easier. We are also at the Center for Reducing Suffering. One of the things we are trying to do, like among other goals, is to also generally increase the amount of resources that are dedicated to this mission of reducing suffering. So yeah, and I do know that, I mean, unfortunately, I don't know so much about this, but my impression is that, I mean, I guess I've heard from many people that animal advocacy, unfortunately, is very funding constrained generally. Yeah, so, but my hope would be that it could be easier. But nonetheless, of course, there are people who manage to find work in at animal organizations, for example. So yeah, I mean, it's difficult for me to give like a general answer about how realistic it is, but like at least like it's encouraging that there are seemingly at least many people who do manage to build a career out of it. But I think it's also worth emphasizing and noting that um, making it a career is not a requirement, right? For still having a beneficial impact and making yeah meaningful efforts and yeah beneficial efforts.
It's actually been very rewarding that since I've become involved, I've been able to be active every week since I first started. So, the more time I put in, the more opportunities just pop up like spontaneously. So it is it is something that's working for me.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, it can be incredibly meaningful. And in fact, I do share that sense that, right, that it can also um, it can be also a genuine outlet for ourselves, right? That it can in some sense provide a relief. And I don't think we need to feel ashamed about that, right? Because it is, I don't know, like it's all kind of part of the journey and part of the effort, right, of trying to reduce suffering, that we find something deeply meaningful about this striving for improvement, right? And of something that's so extremely significant as suffering is.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Thanks so much for the question.
We have a question in the chat about balancing personal interest and what's most effective to reduce suffering, right? So people may be very motivated by an issue, but it may turn out on reflection that this is not the best way to reduce suffering, a particular issue or cause. Um, on the other hand, focusing on what is most urgent may not be most interesting, and so reduce people's motivation. So, how do you think about this potential tension here, and how do you maybe encourage people to, I don't know, overcome this tension?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question, really tricky question, right? Because such tensions, they are definitely, I guess actually they pop up, they appear for all of us, even if whether we're aware of them or not. Um, and then there's a question of how to handle it, and that's actually very non-trivial, right? In the sense that, um, yeah, I'm here reminded of the point about, um, like, so it's one area where I think there are kind of two different answers one can give, right? One answer, maybe on the idealistic side, is okay, and maybe this is the one I'm maybe most inclined to focus on, yeah, or at least the idealistic part of me, right, is to, okay, try to transcend your biases, try not to let yourself be overpowered by these, one might, from this perspective, say like more primitive motivational drives. Try to focus on the arguments and where do the considerations and the evidence point you. Yeah, that's one kind of answer. It's quite idealistic, but then it might also perhaps be too idealistic at the end of the day, in the sense that, okay, but how plastic are our motivations necessarily, right? I know a lot of people have run into challenges of this kind in the context of earning to give, right? So some people can devote themselves to a career where they earn a lot of money to donate, and can be highly motivated to do that. Other people find that difficult, find that challenging. And in that case, I mean, yeah, it's just the less idealistic perspective is to also consider our motivation itself as something that's not necessarily like infinitely malleable, right? It's also a real life constraint that we have to take seriously, and well, ideally use in the best way we can, right? So to make sort of like a crude toy example of this, right? If we say that there's one thing that would be the ideal thing to focus on, and then there's another thing that's maybe say 80% as effective. But then if one is that much more motivated to pursue that thing, then it could be at the end of the day that it might actually be the more effective thing to choose, given one's motivational constraints and the like, right? Or could also be personal fit and so on. So I do think like there are kind of different ways to answer that question, and it does depend on. I would while I to some extent endorse the idealistic answer, I would also caution against um, yeah, the risk of being unrealistic about our own motivational drives, right? Which are also a real like a real factor to consider here.
Yeah. Thanks. Let's go to Vanessa.
Hi, thank you for this session and for writing these books. I think the sort of clear explanation of these concepts is something that's very much needed. Something that I've been feeling for a long time, and I really feel is the importance of compassion. And I really feel that compassion is an enabler, not just at the individual level, as you've kind of described, but if we could increase compassion at a global level, we could increase interest in and backing for and donations to kind of good causes and reducing suffering in general. And also hopefully the baseline of human behavior would naturally cause a reduction of suffering as well. So I'm really interested in how we can get there, how we can get to a world where the skills of compassion and self-compassion are viewed as important as literacy and numeracy. And in this vein, I've spent a while chairing the education working group at the Global Compassion Coalition, and I kind of continue to be very interested in interventions that are focused on ensuring we have compassion in education settings, both in terms of compassionate culture in education settings, but also the having on the curriculum developing those skills of compassion, including self-compassion. I guess I'd kind of really be really interested in your thoughts on whether effective altruism in general should be dedicating funding to that area and to kind of investigating how do we best kind of develop interventions for teaching the skills of compassion and how do we best convince policymakers that this is important? And do you have any thoughts on how to best drive that forward in terms of an agenda or the key risks of doing so? And I know one thing that I keep going back to is the backlash there's been to EDI in the US and how we can kind of avoid that kind of issue.
Right. Yeah. Those are yeah uh, super interesting questions. Thanks a lot. I mean, I first of all say that I think those initiatives you described, they sound like quite wonderful initiatives to me. Um, yeah, I would be quite supportive of such efforts. And honestly, in my opinion, they seem more promising than many of the things that effective altruists are currently pursuing, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, so a lot of questions there. How to best promote compassion broadly? I honestly think it's something that probably has many parts to it, right? So there is, for example, a more of an intellectual part, which is kind of where my project falls in that, um, yeah, like in that domain. Then, of course, there are other domains that admittedly aren't ones that I have focused on that much, but like obviously educational efforts can potentially be helpful. So as you probably know, there is evidence supporting compassion meditation as being actually effective, both in terms of attitudes and also increasing pro-social behavior. So yeah, those efforts I would be quite supportive of. But I should say, yeah, there is, as always, there are these concerns around backfire risks, which I mean, um, apply generally, right? That's not limited to educational efforts. It's also for um, the more intellectually flavored efforts, and that's just a case where, again, yeah, I have to admit that is just super difficult to like guard against and address effectively. Maybe again, I would try to emphasize things like maybe a relatively cautious and perhaps also, yeah, to some extent, I would generally favor like one tries to combine compassion with a focus on reason, also reason and evidence. Um, yeah. Um, yeah, I had another thought that then I think I forgot again. But yeah, those would be some of the things I would highlight. Yeah, I mean that there's a lot to be said about this, and I mean, as you probably know, there's also the organization called the Organization for the Prevention of Intense Suffering, OPUS, which also very much puts this focus on compassion front and center, and trying to work on also including what Jonathan Layton from OPUS is framing as, and in fact, he wrote last year a book on this, Compassionate Governance, right, which is very much also in line with recent politics, having more of a focus on, yeah, compassion and the reduction of suffering in at the level of our politics and our institutions in general. But yeah, it is difficult. I mean, so yeah, probably it's maybe good to move on, because I'm not sure I can say that much more about it. And also, of course, a fuller answer would also involve like delving into various tons of complications about it also. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat about the role of uh, like motivation, and in particular, you mentioned in the book thinking about role models, maybe even mythological or fictional heroes to help us stay motivated, like the underdog character. I understand that this question is worried that this could be a kind of manipulation, or involve going around rationality, which maybe should be our focus in terms of how can we reduce the most suffering, and not focus on these like fictional stories or something like this. I think that's the question. Feel free to add KA if you'd like to add any more to that. But what do you think about the role of uh, these different ways of motivating us?
Right, right. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in general, right, just about any any source of motivation, or indeed just about any tool that we can think of, right, they will have real pitfalls, and this is no exception, I would say. Um, I would highlight though that I think it is also a real pitfall. I mean, again, back to this inverted euchre, right? There is also a real pitfall of not considering motivation at all, or imagining that, okay, I can just do the math, I can just look at an expected value calculation, and from that, motivation will just flow, and I will just be super driven and highly motivated by that. And I think, I mean, of course, maybe to some extent that it might be wonderful if that were the case, but then I don't think that is how we are constituted, right? So it is more a matter of finding um, yeah, a solution that's actually workable, right? Where we actually can drive ourselves. And indeed, I mean, it's maybe also worth saying that the context in which the background context in which we can bring these figures up who can inspire us is a context where we might otherwise feel completely hopeless or demotivated, right? And it's in that kind of situation where I think yeah, well, maybe one can think of it, maybe for some of us, right? The utility might be a bit like a life vest. So, okay, if you don't need that life vest, if you are at no risk of drowning and you're super motivated by the calculations, the moral considerations in themselves, then I think by all means, there's not much need to experiment in that case, right? Although of course it can be difficult to know what the gains are without experimenting. But yeah, so I think there are real pitfalls, right? That one can end up having maybe some kind of superhero delusion about what one is doing, what this project is, and where things are going. But then, yeah, at the same time, right? I think the need for motivation is also real, and shouldn't be understated. And of course, as a maybe an obvious clarification, Mm. Like just like one can watch a movie such as The Lord of the Rings without believing that it's the truth or anything, right? I think similarly we can draw motivational fuel and power from various narratives without imagining that they're real or the like, right? So the cases I mentioned are sort of like just all obviously fictional examples that may nevertheless be inspiring.
Thank you. We have time for a few more questions. If anyone else has a question, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll go to Leonardo in one moment. Leonardo, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, Magnus, I have a couple of follow-up questions. So one is regarding, let's say, the two sides of rationality and compassion. And I want to provide a particular concrete example. So Sam Harris was once speaking about how he knew that, let's say, investing in malaria nets was the best way to, let's say, prevent people from dying, and like its cost effectiveness was really high. But maybe it doesn't feel as, let's say, motivating us going to the river where you see a kid running and you help that kid out. Like that one will be all over the news. That one will be extremely highlighted and give you a greater sense of, oh, I'm doing my role well. The other one, let's say, of making a donation or somehow redirecting resources to causes that are effective. Might still have the same effect or even more, but it doesn't feel that way. For this particular case, like what have you seen that works to, let's say, make that click for people that in a way makes sense to um, invest where your, let's say, money goes farther when it comes to helping lives or reducing suffering?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, I think it's a super difficult question, and it relates to what David brought up earlier about the problem of it being abstract, right? These considerations and our thinking about the impact. And indeed, there is, in some sense, there can be an inherent tension there, right? Where often the case for interventions that appear more effective, right? They will often relate to things that are more a kind of maybe background, ongoing baseline urgency, right? Right. So malaria is something it happens every single day that children sadly die from malaria. And so in that sense, there's nothing remarkable about it. There's nothing newsworthy about it, right? So we have this like also these dysfunctional norms around the news, right, where they can only bring up something that's actually different, which is obviously different, distinct from what's actually important, right, and has moral significance. And the challenge and tension there is to, if we want to explain and make the case for this background urgency, which of course is all the greater when we begin to focus on all these other different kinds of ongoing suffering, right? Then we also risk overwhelming people, right, with this sheer scale of the problem. So it's again a case where I'm not aware of a super compelling way to yeah, thread this needle and make this like very broadly motivating, right? Because this case is then precisely also the kind of, you know, argument or point where unfortunately we will tend to make people disengage and distance themselves from what's being presented, because it can just feel like it's too much, and also the obligation can feel unlimited, right? Or you're telling me there's this many beings suffering, and you're telling me that in some sense more money can just scale the impact, right? But of course, with all that being said, the what I've tried to do is to actually lay out the case and the scenario and the reality as I see it, right? In the hope that, you know, because there are some people who are willing to, yeah, explore these considerations and take action, even if it's if it seems abstract. And yeah, I'm not sure whether there necessarily is a way to yeah, that whether there is something one can say that's going to be universally or even broadly compelling and motivating to people to make an impact. But as I mentioned earlier, perhaps one of the best options is to first like make the abstract argument, right? Focus on the difference we can make against this background of ongoing horrors, and then try to make that as concrete as we can, as motivating as we can.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have one final question, perhaps a short question? One, Annabella? You know, one thing I was wondering about is if this this book might encourage a focus on the self. That's perhaps more than we want. You do discuss this, Magnus, about dangers on both sides of self-absorption and concern with status, but also total self-transcendence. I'm curious about your thoughts on this and how we might sort of thread the needle here.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question, and indeed another case where very much I think that the target is like a healthy balance, a healthy integration, right, of both and. Like we do want to not neglect ourselves, to not lose sight of ourselves and our own needs. But then it's true that we also don't want to fall into a state where this like becomes the project in itself, right? That we want to like keep both things in mind, in view, and like have like this like you say like elegant synthesis and integration where we take good care of ourselves, keeping in mind this broader potential for impact, right? This broader world we exist in, the larger reality out there, and and of course there's a lot one can say specifically about how we relate to the self as a key focus of chapter 12 in the book, where I do argue for this in brief, like this approach of both having like these, in some sense, self-transcendent capacities of being able to step back from our immediate experience and observe it without over-identifying or fixating on any specific aspect of our experience, not letting it define us in some deeper way, while then at the same time also cultivating a strong sense of moral and compassionate self-identity that can help be like an underlying framework that guides us, and that is indeed like inherently related to, tied to the broader reality, right, and the broader impact that we're trying to have.
Great, thank you. I think we should leave it there. And thank you so much, Magnus, for that. That was super interesting. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions. And yeah, hope to see you soon.
Thanks so much. I also want to say thanks to everyone who has helped support and make this book possible. Yeah, it wouldn't have been possible without the support from, including people who are in this call. So thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.